Read Japanese Literature. My name is Allison Fincher. Read Japanese Literature is a podcast about Japanese fiction and some of its best works. All the works we discuss are available in translation, so you can read along if you want, and you can find out more at readjapaneseliterature.com. Welcome to Season 2! In our first set of episodes, Read Japanese Literature took a broad look at the history of Japanese fiction. We started with the oldest recorded stories in Japan all the way through the 1980s or so. Moving forward, I'd like to talk about some specific authors, some of the most important books, or some of my favorite books. There are themes we can follow from one book to another, and there are important moments when Japan's history and literature seem to intersect. So now you've heard what topics interest me. I'd love to hear what topics interest you. Use the contact page on the website, readjapaneseliterature.com, or reach out to us through Twitter at readjapaneselit. While you're on Twitter, be sure to follow the podcast. I post author quotes, links to extra info, and ideas that don't quite make it into each episode. The Twitter feed is also a great way to keep up with new English language releases of Japanese fiction. In our episodes so far, we've talked almost exclusively about what Japanese literature looks like in Japan. But we're English speakers and English readers on an English language podcast about Japanese literature in English. So today, in honor of Women in Translation Month, we're talking about why there is such a wealth of contemporary books by Japanese women available in English. Doppo Kunikida was a famous 19th century Japanese novelist. In an 1898 essay, he wrote about why translating was the appropriate vocation for literary-minded women, a much more appropriate vocation than writing fiction of their own. Let me read you a few excerpts translated by Judy Wakabayashi. Writing original works calls for powers of observation, past experience, inspiration, sustained periods of time, and occasional travel. Sometimes it also requires one to live alone, and without talent it is impossible. Given their circumstances, it is certainly not something that can be expected of a large number of women. Women's translating endeavors would not, first, interfere with married life. In fact, they can consult with their husbands and benefit greatly from their advice. Second, translating does not interfere with having children, since women can engage in translation in their leisure hours. Third, it requires neither powers of observation nor travel. All they need to do is sit in a room with a dictionary and a source text on their desk. To give credit where credit is due, Kunikida was actually being fairly progressive for Meiji Japan. Kunikida was also writing a defense of women's education here, particularly women's education in language. Language study by girls, he wrote elsewhere in the essay, is far from a waste of time, and their skills should certainly be put to use so that women can forge our nation's destiny along with men. Doppo Kunikida had a higher opinion of women's abilities than many of his contemporaries. And if you read between the lines of his suggestions, you notice that he is actually pretty clear that the limits women face are set by their circumstances more than their abilities. I think it's fair to say that Kunikida's problem is less sexism than a dramatic misunderstanding of the work that goes into translation and the work that goes into rearing a family. But today we're going to talk about how writing by women, not just translation, came to be an integral part of modern Japanese literature, both in Japan and in the rest of the world. We're going to start with a brief look at the evolution of women's writing in Japan after the heyday of Meiji-era women's writing. Then we'll look at the growth of Japanese translation into English, especially in the last decade. And then we'll still end on a Japanese author and novel, Sayaka Murata and Convenience Store Woman, which came out in English translation in 2018. It's a book that wasn't just a smash hit in Japan, it also changed the narrative for Japanese women in translation in the English-speaking world. Before we go any further, I want to ask a question. When is and isn't it useful to talk about women's writing? It's always problematic to limit any human being to a single characteristic of their self. Gender is especially thorny. As you'll see in just a minute, classifying writing by authors who happen to be women as women's writing has made work for 20th century female writers in Japan complicated. But sometimes grouping people into a class, like a class by gender, gives us a chance to look at the way culture and the world around them affected the way they lived and worked. In the case of women writers in Japan, so many factors shaped their careers in their writing. The culture, the publishing industry, their readers, their expectation of themselves. And that's what I want to talk about for the next few minutes. The last time we talked about women's writing, we more or less ended our story in 1898. 20 years later, some things had changed for women in Japan. Scholars disagree on exactly how literate Japan's women were before the turn of the century, but by 1900, about 97% of Japanese girls were finishing their compulsory 4-year educations. As a result, literacy in Japan, among both men and women, was almost universal. A university education was out of reach for most women in 1920, but by the mid-1920s, about 10% of university graduates were women. Women were also entering the labor force outside of the home like never before, and increasingly they were taking white-collar jobs as nurses, elementary school teachers, secretaries, telephone operators. This meant several things. A, they were out of their homes on a daily basis. B, they often had some amount of disposable income to spend as they liked. And C, they often got to spend time with other like-minded members of their own gender around their own age. As a result of these kinds of changes, women became major consumers of reading material. Selling them literary magazines and newspapers was potentially big business. In an earlier episode, we talked a good bit about Japan's literary magazines and newspapers. You might remember that serials in magazines and newspapers were the way most Japanese people consumed stories at this moment in Japanese history. Stories often got divided into two categories, and the journals they were published in helped reinforce that division. The two categories were Junbungaku or Taishu Bungaku, pure literature or popular literature. Writing by women was usually classed with the kind of popular literature critics didn't take seriously, regardless of whether or not it was any good. When publishers set out to capture their share of the market selling stories to women, they started labeling these publications with a third category, Joryu Bungaku, or women's literature. Before the 1920s, women writers were talked about and had often been referred to using labels like Keishu Sakka, or lady writers. This was more of a description of who was doing the writing than anything else. Joryu Bungaku was more than a description of the author. It became something like a genre. It even had its own section in Japanese bookstores, starting in the 1910s or 20s, all the way through the 1990s. Actually, one Twitter friend saw a women's fiction section at a major bookstore in Tokyo just before everything shut down in March 2020. And another tells me they occasionally run into bookstores with separate women's fiction sections. When people pick up genre fiction, they have certain expectations about what they'll find inside. An I novel will be confessional. Proletarian literature will be about the working class. And a Joryu Bungaku, well, that's a bit of a problem, isn't it? The things women were writing didn't have all that much in common. Men got grouped into genres or literary schools for a lot of reasons. They were writing the same kinds of books on the same themes, or they held the same underlying philosophy, or they had the same political beliefs, or they published in the same journals, or attended the same literary gatherings. Women got grouped together on the basis of their gender alone. Joryu Bungaku stories were usually published in ladies' magazines that were expressly marketed to women. These ladies' magazines weren't taken seriously by the literary establishment, the bundan. I should note that women weren't the only contributors to ladies' magazines. Even the famously masculinist author Yukio Mishima earned his daily bread by serializing some of his novels in women's magazines. In some ways, these not serious ladies' magazines were a boon to women writers. It granted them extra visibility. For example, by the summer of 1930, the important newspaper, the Asahi Shimbun, regularly featured fictional stories by women. This was new. On the other hand, ladies' magazines undermined some women writers' effort to get taken seriously. Some women formed serious literary journals so they'd have a forum to publish their writing. Under growing scrutiny from the state and mounting financial pressure, most major female-led literary journals folded in the early 1930s. As we've discussed in earlier episodes, the 1930s were an era of growing state control. In the lead up to the Pacific War, rhetoric about a woman's role as good wife and wise mother became even more heated, and life became more complicated for women who wanted to write. At the same time, there were also a small number of women writers who rose to prominence in the 1930s. Unfortunately, most of them were as well known for their love lives as they were for their writing. The Akutagawa Prize was another product of the 1930s. It was founded in 1935 in honor of Ryunosuke Akutagawa. It was and is one of Japan's most sought-after literary prizes. I'm going to use it today for a really imperfect measure to fill in broad trends of who is getting published and who is being taken the most seriously in the Japanese publishing industry. I know this is an extremely imprecise measure at best, but this is information that's easily available to me. It's worth noting that it didn't take all that long for a woman to win Japan's most coveted literary prize. In 1938, Tsuneko Nakazato became the 9th person to win and the first woman to win the Akutagawa. The Pacific War itself was a difficult time for all writers who weren't actively involved in promoting the war. There were a few prominent women involved in war work. This includes Yoshiko Shibaki, one of the 2 women who won the Akutagawa Prize in the 1940s. The mid to late 40s were a difficult time in Japan. There was no Akutagawa Prize at all, awarded between 1944 and 1948, the last days of the war and the early days of the American occupation. The reforms imposed by the American occupation changed a lot of things for Japanese writers. We devoted a good deal of an earlier podcast episode to what those changes looked like. In short, the occupation ended many of the censorship laws that most limited what writers could write. The new Japanese constitution also granted a variety of fundamental human rights. In particular for women, it gave explicit guarantees of equality in marriage, divorce, property, inheritance, and other matters pertaining to marriage and family. At least in the wording of the Constitution, women in Japan have more legal protections than women in most of the world, including the United States. Donald Keene is probably the most prominent English-language critic of Japanese literature. In his words, these kinds of legal protections, quote, inspired women to write in a different and generally more effective vein. Keene is undoubtedly right. Even some of the most popular female writers of the 1930s published their most important work after the war. But it also took some time for the publishing industry and the reading public to catch up. Unless I've made a mistake, not a single female author won an Akutagawa Prize in the 1950s. The 50s are the only decade in which no women won the award. Women did slightly better, winning Akutagawa Prizes in the 1960s and 70s. They won a little more than 20% of the awards in the 60s and a little less than 20% in the 70s. And for the first time ever, the work of some of these female Akutagawa winners was translated into English. In many ways, this small improvement was part of a broader social trend for women. Women writers also started to outright reject that genre, Joryu Bungaku. In the 1970s and 80s, Japanese feminists started to substitute other words for Joryu in Joryu Bungaku. This would be something like changing woman for female, just to break the stigma associated with the Joryu Bungaku label. The percentage of female Akutagawa winners crawled upwards in the 1980s and 1990s. 47% of the awards went to women in the 80s, 36% in the 90s and the aughts. By the 2010s, translator Alison Markin Powell discovered that a sea change had taken place in Japanese publishing. This is how she described it. I decided to look at the authors who had won the two most well-known literary awards in Japan, the Akutagawa Prize and the Naoki Prize, and also the authors of the 50 best-selling novels each year. The Naoki Prize is awarded each year to the best work of popular fiction by a new writer. Powell goes on, I found that women writers were well represented in both areas. There was something close to parity, and women had even outperformed men in some years. It's way too early to make a prediction about what the 2020s will look like at the decade's end, but it's worth noting that of the 7 Akutagawa awardees since 2020, 5 have been women. Now, at no point in the last several minutes have I meant to imply that positive movement means Japanese writers haven't still faced obstacles in the last several decades, or that they don't still face obstacles today based on their gender. Phyllis Birnbaum is an important translator from Japanese to English. In the 80s, she described encountering what she called a leading Japanese novelist, and that he, quote, urbanely poured another cup of sake and assured me that no, he would never dream of reading anything written by women. Japanese literature was a more or less niche market in English for most of the 20th century. There are a few authors that made for special exceptions. Donald Keene calls Ryunosuke Akutagawa the first Japanese writer to attract wide attention abroad. Globally, Yukio Mishima was probably the best-known 20th century Japanese writer. Yasunari Kawabata, whom we haven't discussed yet, was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1968, so he was well known at least in literary circles. Shusaku Endo and Kobo Abe both had devoted readers of their own outside of Japan, and both of them generated a good bit of Nobel buzz as well. There were also a couple of major anthologies in English of Japanese literature for people who cared to read them. Up to this point, only really big-name women writers made a name for themselves outside of Japan. And that has affected the way people outside of Japan understand the story of Japanese literature. Marginalized groups, including women, often get left out of canons. Women often get left out of the canon in Japan, but they especially get left out of the canon in the English-speaking world because they just haven't been widely available. For the most part, you'll only encounter many 20th century Japanese women writers if you know in advance who you're looking for. Even then, you often have to go digging for translated books that are out of print, or you have to actually read Japanese. this absence has shaped English speakers' understanding of Japanese literature. Donald Keene mentions 7 women in his massive 1,400-page Dawn to the West, Japanese Literature of the Modern Era. This is one of the key texts people who are interested in modern Japanese literature often turn to. None of them earn more than just a few pages in Keene's account of Japan's literary history. But in the 1980s, 5 women translators produced 3 anthologies specifically of Japanese women writers. While this doesn't really sound like a big deal, it was. When Japanese women appeared in anthologies up to this point, they were often pretty obviously presented as token presences. The anthologies were almost entirely made up of men. The printing of these 3 anthologies really marks the beginning of Anglo-American attention to writing by Japanese women. As we discussed in an earlier episode, Banana Yoshimoto was one of the first Japanese women writers to gain much traction in English-language publishing. Kitchen came out in English translation in 1993 with moderate success. 3 more of her novels and short story collections were published in English in the 90s. Besides Banana Yoshimoto's novels, there weren't a lot of books being published in translation from Japanese in the 1990s by men or women. There were a handful of novels by Haruki Murakami. Murakami first appeared in English translation in the 80s. There were a couple of short stories by Yukio Mishima, newly translated in the 90s. Mishima, of course, had been dead for more than 20 years. And some of Kenzaburo Oe's work was translated into English after he won the Nobel Prize in 1994. Translation from Japanese took off in the 2000s, but it was mostly on behalf of one and only one male writer. The 2000s were the heyday of Haruki Murakami. Murakami became something of an international media darling. His books have sold millions of copies in English and inspired the kinds of publicity even the most popular English-language writers usually only dream of. His popularity and sales sent publishers in search of the next Murakami, a Japanese author who would be wildly popular in translation. And you still see on the backs of many newly published books from Japanese, the next Murakami, or in reviews, if you like Murakami, you will also like. But translations of Murakami didn't really change the situation for most Japanese writers hoping to break into English, especially not for women. But in 2016, 3 prominent English-language Japanese translators happened to meet at the London Book Fair: Alison Markin Powell, Lucy North, and Jenny Tapley Takamori. Along with editor Yuka Igarashi, they hosted a reading at the Society Club in Soho, where they read from some of their translations, and they named the reading Strong Women, Soft Power. Soft power is a political idea that a country's culture might also be able to exert a kind of force and influence abroad. That reading was part of a movement to note and to do something about the underrepresentation of women in translation. Using a database called 3%, maintained by the University of Rochester, the group discovered that there was slightly more than 1 book in translation from Japanese by a female author published for every 10 books by a male one. Later in 2016, they published a wish list on LitHub of 10 Japanese books by women we'd love to see in English. And you can find a link to that wish list on the episode page. It says something powerful about these women's success that 5 of their titles have been published in English already. Another is scheduled for publication in 2023. 2 more of the authors they've listed have had other titles newly published in English, even if the specific works they mentioned on the list have not. Today, Strong Women Soft Power is something of an intellectual collective of literary translators with the goal of offering support, pooling resources, and strengthening the position of literary translators. Some of the most popular and well-received works in translation from Japanese of the last 6 years were translated by these women. This includes The Lady Joker sequence by Kaoru Takamura, The Woman in the Purple Skirt by Natsuko Imamura, and Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata, which we'll discuss in just a minute. The women of Strong Women Soft Power, of course, aren't the only people contributing to the translation of Japanese women. Translators Sam Bett and David Boyd, for example, have been bringing us the work of Mieko Kawakami, a tour de force in Japanese publishing who has openly challenged Haruki Murakami for the sexism in his books. Together, they've translated 3 of her novels. The work of Strong Women's Soft Power also coincides with a global movement to promote the translation of women's writing. 2 of the more public efforts are Women in Translation Month and the Warwick Prize for Women in Translation. In August 2014, a research biologist and book lover named Maytal Radzinski launched Women in Translation Month. People all over the world now participate each August on social media using the hashtag WITmonth. And in 2017, the UK's University of Warwick announced the Warwick Prize for Women in Translation. It was set up, quote, to address the gender imbalance in translated literature and to increase the number of international women's voices accessed by a British and Irish readership. Since the award was established, 2 books by Japanese women have been shortlisted. In 2021, one of the shortlisted titles was Breasts and Eggs by Mieko Kawakami, translated by Sam Bett and David Boyd. In the award's first year, the winning novel was Memoirs of a Polar Bear by Yoko Tawada, translated by Susan Bernofsky. This is an interesting case. Yoko Tawada is a Japanese author. Memoirs of a Polar Bear is actually translated from German. Tawada is an amazing author who writes literary fiction in both Japanese and German and will definitely be getting an episode of her own. It's truly astonishing, the myths that persist about what happens when you actively promote the work of a marginalized group, in this case, women. About 8 months ago, I was part of a social media discussion about the translation of Japanese women. Some of the people participating in the discussion thought that publishing the work of so many women represented an unbalanced choice by Western publishers. Someone even thought the English translations being released overwhelmingly represented women writers. Other commenters asked whether publishers and translators were giving Western readers a false impression that Japanese publishing is dominated by women. All of these assumptions are based on either bad information or made in bad faith. I hope I have made a good case that the Japanese publishing industry has made great strides, and that publishing the work of women in translation in no way misrepresents the current state of publishing in Japan. I keep track of Japanese titles coming out in English, not plays, poems, manga, light novels, or children's books. Of course I miss things, but at least I'm well informed. If you're interested, you can find a list on the episode page. I'm currently tracking 32 translations from Japanese into English for 2022. 16 of those books are by women, exactly half. 15 of those titles are translated by women, 15 are translated by men or teams of men, and 2 are translated by mixed gender teams. So the idea that women are being overrepresented is patently false. But the work of translators in the last 5 years has created a situation that is not only more equitable, but better represents what the publishing industry looks like in Japan. I want to wrap up today with the work of Sayaka Murata, in particular Convenience Store Woman. The book was a game changer for the work of Japanese women in English translation. Sayaka Murata was born in 1979, not all that far out of Tokyo. As a kid, she was an avid reader of mysteries and sci-fi, and she started writing when she was in the 4th grade. Murata won the Gunzo Prize for New Writers for her first novel, Breastfeeding, in 2003. Her breakthrough, though, came in 2016 with the publication of her 10th novel, Convenience Store Woman. That year, Convenience Store Woman won the Akutagawa Prize. Since then, it has sold more than 600,000 copies in Japan. From 1999 until 2017, while she wrote and published her first 10 novels, Sayaka Murata herself was working part-time as a convenience store clerk in Tokyo. Convenience Store Woman helped change the narrative of publishing and translation. It was published in English in 2018, and it has been translated into more than 30 other languages as well. All told, it has sold more than 1.5 million copies worldwide. The response to Convenience Store Woman was unprecedented for a work in translation from Japanese, at least for a work that wasn't by Haruki Murakami. It was an LA Times bestseller. It was named a Best Book of the Year by The New Yorker, The Boston Globe, LitHub, BuzzFeed. It got reviews on NPR's Fresh Air and CBS This Morning. David Boyd, a very prominent Japanese to English translator, has written that, quote, publishers used to ask translators for the next Murakami. For the past 3 years or so, they've been asking for the next Convenience Store Woman. Keiko Furukura is 36. She's been working part-time at Smile Mart for half of her life. She's always known that she's a little bit different. But working at a convenience store gives her life purpose and direction. The store manual organizes her world. The routine tells her what she is supposed to do with her time. Her uniform tells her what to wear. And her coworkers as examples tell her how to behave. For 18 years, she has been happy to define herself as a convenience store employee. One American critic described Convenience Store Woman as brilliant, witty, and sweet in ways that recall Amelie and Shop Girl. The novel's marketing in English was a pretty blatant appeal to the kawaii aesthetic, cuteness. Japanese women are supposed to be cute, right? In Britain, the book had a pastel blue, yellow, or pink cover with a title in contrasting bold white writing. In the middle, there was a fish-shaped soy sauce container with a bright red cap. The North American cover featured a little onigiri rice ball shaped like a cutesy smiling girl next to a flower of pink ginger. While the novel is wry, it isn't really funny. Translator Jenny Tapley Takamori has confirmed that Murata never intended for her book to be a comedy. Most importantly, it's a critique of how weird the cultural norms we take for granted actually are. Like many of Murata's protagonists, Keiko thinks about society as a machine. This is an important motif in Murata's Earthlings, too. Keiko rather likes being part of that machine. That's what her job at Smile Mart gives her. Her first day on the job, she thinks, I've been reborn. I've actually become a normal cog in society. Now that she's 36, there are certain expectations of adult women in the machine of society. One expectation is professional. Japanese society looks down on people with part-time jobs like Keiko's. One of Keiko's coworkers describes a different 30-something part-timer as a dead-ender, the worst type, just a burden on society. He excuses Keiko from that characterization, but it isn't exactly flattering. Another expectation of adult women in the machine of society is romance and sex, followed by marriage, followed by children. Keiko isn't interested in working anywhere besides Smile Mart, and she most definitely isn't interested in romance or sex or marriage or children. It's worth noting that English forced the translator, Jenny Tapley Takamori, to make certain concessions when she translated the title of Convenience Store Woman. In Japanese, the title has gendered implications by being ungendered. The title translates more literally into the awkward convenience store person. Murata has spoken about how much she enjoyed her own time working at a convenience store because it released her from being a woman. And at one point in the novel, Keiko remarks, "Here in the convenience store, we're not men and women. We're all store workers." For most of Keiko's life, her sister has helped her come up with explanations that help her life make sense to everyone else. Now that Keiko's biological clock seems to be running out, The other people in Keiko's life just can't understand how she could possibly be happy as a single part-time worker with no romantic partner and no expectations of marriage or family. Eventually, a new employee joins the store, a man about Keiko's age. There isn't a lot to admire in this young man. He tends to spout extremely misogynistic screeds. The youngest, prettiest girls in the village go to the strongest hunters. They leave strong genes, while the rest of us just have to console ourselves with what's left. Our so-called modern society is just an illusion. On the other hand, Keiko and this young man have a certain amount in common. Neither of them leads the life they're expected to live. Hoping to be a better cog in society, Keiko decides to invite this young man to live with her and pretend to be her boyfriend. She quits her job at Smile Mart and resolves to live a more ordinary life. Keiko is shocked, and maybe the reader will be too. Her family is so pleased. She's unemployed and living with someone none of them have met. But at least she's not working at a convenience store anymore. And at least she's not alone. The ending of Convenience Store Woman is pleasantly affirming, if open-ended. Side note, I'd like to warn you that the endings of some of Murata's other work aren't always pleasant. Her English language follow-up, Earthlings, is badly in need of content warnings, even though the cover features an extremely cute hedgehog. The best one-sentence summary of the novel Earthlings that I've seen is from a Twitter friend who wrote, quote, "After Convenience Store Woman, I was not expecting the cannibalism." Anyway, Keiko realizes the only person she can be is herself. The young man challenges her decision. He says, "You're out of your mind. The village mentality of society will never permit such a creature to exist. It goes against all the rules. You'll just be persecuted by everyone and live a lonely life." And the reader is left to ponder whether the life Keiko has chosen is really possible in the society she lives in. A lot of English speakers who read Convenience Store Woman want to read Keiko as neurodivergent or autistic. I really understand the desire to find representation in literature. Literature does not do a great job with characters who don't look, act, and think like everybody else. Alienation, though, is a human experience shared by many people all over the world, whether or not they are neurotypical. I think it might be more useful to read Murata as a part of the Japanese tradition of characters who feel like they are isolated from the rest of society. The most famous example is probably Osamu Dazai and his novel No Longer Human, which we've discussed in an earlier episode. And Murata has spoken and written enough publicly that we know she writes about her character's alienation from personal experience, the same way that Dazai did. I think this excerpt from a recent Wired interview with Sayaka Murata might help clarify what I'm trying to say. In college, Murata took a course in psychology. When she opened her textbook, she saw all her worries about her family, about the way her own mind worked, outlined on that very first page. And she took it as a clue that her anxieties about not being human were normal. She said, quote, "If you dissect it and analyze it, it's classic human. I'm extremely ordinary." So why read Japanese women in translation? First of all, you should read Japanese women in translation because these are some of the very best books coming out of Japan right now. If you're not reading Japanese women writers, you're missing something like half of the new Japanese books in English, including a lot of the most critically acclaimed, and obviously including Convenience Store Woman. When you go back and read older works by women in translation, you fill in some of the gaps in the story of Japanese literature as most English readers understand it. And I'd like to quote translator Alison Markin Powell because she makes a great case for reading all women in translation, whether they write in Japanese or another language besides English. By reading women in translation, by buying or borrowing books, but also by talking about them in any medium, readers demonstrate that there is a demand for the subjects that women choose to write about and the perspective that they offer, that it makes a difference who tells the story and why they tell it. Today, I've been reading from Jenny Topley Takamori's translation of Convenience Store Woman. You can find links to purchase that book as well as resources and a bibliography at readjapaneseliterature.com. For this episode, there are also recommendations translated by all three Strong Women Soft Power translators, including some short stories and excerpts you can read for free. Next time, writing about Japan's have-nots, the people on the economic margins of Japanese society. We'll talk about the so-called lost decade after the bursting of Japan's economic bubble and the quiet political undertones of a lot of the most recent Japanese novels to come out in English translation. Finally, a quick podcast announcement. Read Japanese Literature now has a Patreon campaign. It's a great way to support the podcast and the resources at readjapaneseliterature.com for as little as $5 a month. For $10 a month, you'll get a lovely Read Japanese Literature laptop sticker. And for $25 a month, I'll send you a personalized Japanese book recommendation in your email inbox each month. Find out more at patreon.com/readjapaneseliterature. You can still support Read Japanese Literature in other ways. Leave us a review on your podcast app of choice and buy our books through our bookshop.org website. Find a link at readjapaneseliterature.com. We'd love to hear your thoughts about the podcast. You can always tweet us at @ReadJapaneseLit or use the contact page on the website. Once again, I am grateful to Rebecca Copeland, not just for decades of extraordinary scholarship, but for her help getting the resources I needed for this episode. Thank you to the Strong Women Soft Power Group. Thank you to all translators of Japanese fiction. Thank you to the Japanese Literature Twitter community, the Japanese Literature group on Goodreads, and the Japanese Literature group on Facebook. And finally, thank you as always to producer Kime for today's music at Kime Music and KimeMusic.com.